Hello and welcome. I am Sophronia Scott, Director of the Alma College MFA in Creative Writing, and this is Faculty Fridays. This is your opportunity to learn more about the tremendous instructors that we have waiting for you in our MFA program. And today we have with us the wonderful multi-genre writer, Robert Vivian. Robert Vivian was born in Denver, Colorado, and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. Dozens of his plays have been produced in New York City and elsewhere, and his poems, essays, and stories have appeared in many literary journals, including Georgia Review, Harper's, Ecotone, Creative Nonfiction, and others. He's published 4 novels, 2 books of meditative essays, and his most recent book is a collection of dervish essays entitled All I Feel Is Rivers. He's also co-edited a new and fabulous anthology with Joel Peckham called Wild Gods, the ecstatic in contemporary poetry and prose. He has visited and taught in Turkey several times and has been heavily influenced by the works of Rumi. In the summer, he tries to fly fish in northern Michigan every day, and when he can't, he dreams about it anyway. And if you're a student with us in summer residency, you will get to experience that because you will go fly fishing with Robert Vivian. This is part of our programming as we continue to incorporate the study of place, environment, and nature in our creative writing explorations at the Alma MFA. So thank you for joining us today, Dee. I'm happy to have you with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Froni. I've again moved to the core of my being. Thank you so much for such a and I guess we're talking about rhythm, and I think we're gonna focus on repetition, which I call the R&R.
Yes, so we're completing the R&R cycle. So yes, today, repetition.
Yeah, and I guess for my own limited part, for these wonderful opportunities to offer viewers, fellow writers, just kind of questions to consider, to ponder in your own creative lives. And so apropos of that, to consider, it sounds kind of like an open-ended question. What is the place of repetition in your writing life and in your work itself? And I'm thinking of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous speech, I Have a Dream, where he repeats that anaphora, I have a dream, I forget how many times, 14 times, something like that. And there's a funny anecdote about his advisors at the time said, Dr. King, I think you're repeating yourself too much with the I have a dream. And I think, well, historically, I think that worked out pretty well. But it's interesting that, I use the anaphora, the repetition of a particular word or phrase, which for me is really essential. More and more, I write kind of experimental essays, and they often begin with a phrase or a word that I riff on. And so I just would invite, fellow writers to think about the power of anaphora, not only in terms of poetry, which is usually a poetic device, but also in prose. And also to think about what those areas of your life where repetition is both a kind of heaven, and in those areas in which it's a kind of hell. The French philosopher Simone Weil said about repetition somewhere that it is that gateway. It can either lead straight to heaven or straight to hell. Some things that I worked loading trucks for UPS for 4 years. And that was an incredibly repetitive job, and sometimes infernal. It's like it never let up. And yet there were times when just the repetition of getting a package off the belt, stepping into the car, you can't call UPS trucks car, you can't call them trucks. You have to call them cars because they're a shipping company. Where that repetition of very physical work became, sometimes, some days it was hell, but other other days that repetition was, you kind of like get into the flow of things.
Hmm.
So Sophronia mentioned fly fishing, and for me, that's one of the great joys of fly fishing, is that it is so repetitive. And you, to such a degree that sometimes one can get lost in a kind of fugue state where you're casting and you're moving. And it's a repetition that I just never tire of, although sometimes I get tired physically. So Sophronia, I was wondering for you, like, what repetitions do you experience that they just never get old? You love to repeat.
Hmm. It has to be, well, when I think about doing things in the garden, right? So digging up bulbs, right? Cutting lilacs. The motions aren't as repetitive in the way that you describe, but I appreciate the timing of, oh, I know May is going to come. I know the lilacs are going to be there, right? I think repetition for me, though, and don't laugh at this, I tend to watch, if something has grasped my ear or my eye, like a movie, I will watch it again and again and again. And I don't tire of it. Probably drives my family crazy, but usually there's something in the repetition of something that I'm seeing or hearing that eventually manifests itself into a piece of writing. And I don't even know what it is that I'm working through, but there's something in it, and I have to consume it again and again and again.
Well, and Sophronia, you know David Joust, a
Yeah.
dear friend and colleague at where I used to teach, and he has a chapter, and I'm blanking on the name of the book, but the name of the chapter is what we talk about when we talk about flow.
Mm.
And David makes incredibly compelling case that flow, he says, and the essay was inspired by this question that you get in creative writing classes, where people of goodwill will say about a piece of writing, well, it flows well. Yeah. And David asked, well, what do you mean by that? And so he really broke it down, and he said, flow is simply the byproduct of varying syntax length. So, and he has two hilarious examples where he takes the D.H. Lawrence story and he makes every sentence the same length, and it becomes incredibly monotonous and boring. And then he looks at, I forget, another piece where it's long sentence, little longer, long, long, short, short, where the rhythm is kind of broken up a little bit. But that's flow, repetition, rhythm. I know for athletes, well, for any dancers, for writers, when we're in the flow, I don't know how you feel from it, but there's hardly anything else more exalted than that state where you're in that flow. You're Roger Federer or Serena Williams, and you're returning and you're returning and you're returning and you're returning, or you're casting and you're casting, you're casting. Or in writing lyrically, for me, the anaphora, there's the anchor point, and you go down this way and then you come back, and then anaphora, then you go down this way. Here's an example to ground this. So one anaphora that haunted me for weeks was like, because there are ghosts. I heard that phrase and I'm like, oh, that's really, I like that. Because there are ghosts, and then I come back to it. Because there are ghosts. And that anaphora, that anaphora anchor point became the point of repetition from which paradoxically could start to improvise and play off. So maybe, fellow writers, to think about anaphora as a kind of anchor point of repetition, as a way to anchor your writing, but also play radically off the riff. Does that sound crazy?
No, you know what? I just had this vision. I just had this vision of an anchor, like like anchoring into the side of a mountain and then having a line descend from that so that you can like swing around and up and down different sides of the mountain like you're rock climbing,
Oh, I love
or rappelling. I don't know why I thought of that, but that's what it felt like.
that. I love all kinds of music, but there's a particular composer that is really dear to me. He's an Estonian composer, and his name is Arvo Pärt. And he's some people, I don't know if this is dismissive but some people call him a holy minimalist, where his music it's incredibly profound, but it uses repetition. In fact, that's the whole backbone. I'm not a musicologist, I don't read, but to my untutored ear, he uses repetition in such a beautiful, compelling way. And I don't know if I've absorbed, on some level, I must have absorbed his example into my own work. David's piece that I mentioned, we talk about flow. In another chapter, he talks about this, I guess it's a psychological reality. It's called the musical unconscious, that this is a real thing. And he uses the example of Gerard Manley Hopkins' Record of Deutschland, where for years, apparently Hopkins had been haunted by the tone of the poem, but he didn't have the words.
Mm.
And so I sometimes ask fellow writers, have you ever you've got the tone, you just don't have the words. I mean, has that happened to you, Fern?
Unforgivable Love was a sound to me long before that novel became a novel, that it was the heart of a bluesy kind of jazz, right? And of a woman's longing. So I felt like I heard that novel before it was a novel. Yeah.
I think there's something profoundly true about it. Maybe writers are, among other things, kind of very sensitive to tones of the culture, tones of individual characters. I certainly felt when I wrote my first novel a long time ago, I felt, this sounds grandiose, but I felt like I was at that time in a transitional space. And so I was driving across huge swaths of America a lot. And I thought, I don't have it now, it's gone. But I had this tone of an American, marginalized voices all across America. It was like a tone that I was listening to. Mm. I only realized that in retrospect. This was many, many years ago. But I was haunted by that. I was like, what are people's stories out across the hinterlands and these marginalized areas? What do they believe in? You know, it was quite captivating at the time, but that tone had its own duration and I couldn't recreate that. It wasn't mine to recreate. It was just something I had heard.
Let me ask you this. When you're working with repetition, and I know your dervish essays, sometimes there is a repeated phrase, but sometimes there isn't. And yet there is a feeling of repetitive energy in those pieces. So how do you do that when there's not necessarily a repeated phrase? Or maybe there was when you initially wrote it and took it out. I don't know.
That's a great question. For those dervish essays, I don't have a great deal of intellectual understanding about how they occur. So that sounds evasive, but it's more of and I'm quite sincere in this, it's more of like a weird chemical urgency. It's an actual, like, it's a chemical thing. It's like, and it goes back to a writer I alluded to in another one of these wonderful Friday talks, Gaston Bachelard, where he talks about basically the whole world is just a series of vibrations. And people are either attuned to those or ignore them or just not quite receptive to them. And so how that manifests itself between repetition and departure, Froni, I'm not wise enough to say. But it is a real thing. You know, there's a story that Eckhart Tolle, the modern spiritual teacher, he talks about how before one of the really disastrous tsunamis struck in Southeast Asia, all the animals, days before the storm struck, had already crawled or traveled to higher land. Clearly, they had felt something that humans, we have lost the capacity to feel. Well, some humans, I know there are probably some indigenous cultures and that are more in tune with the tone, the vibrations of the earth, not to sound too. And so, to pivot kind of in an abrupt way, to me in our modern life, some of the repetitions that are part of the America that I've experienced are sometimes bordering on, they're very destructive. And I just, again, this is as creatives to just ask yourself, what forms of repetition are healthy? What forms are not so healthy? So it's hard for me to distinguish between a deep sense of rhythm and a deep sense of repetition, because I just sense they have deep kinship.
Yeah. And there's a certain amount, and we mentioned this before, a lot of intuition involved as well.
Yeah, and maybe it's a rhetorical question, but how does one cultivate a sense of intuition, or honor it? Maybe
I think it's honor it, because I think we all have it. You know, you mentioned the animals, right? My favorite comment is, you never see a deer stop in the woods and go, oh, that was probably nothing. So let's leave it there. And if you would like to join this conversation, because this is an ongoing conversation that we will be having in lectures and workshops at our residencies, please come join this creative writing exploration. We are the Alma College MFA in creative writing. We are currently taking applications for our next cohort. You can learn more at our website, alma.edu/MFA. I'm Sophronia Scott. He's Robert Vivian. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.